Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah. Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. Ashhadu anna Muhammad Rasulullah. Hayya al-salah. Hayya al-salah. Hayya al-falah. Hayya al-falah. Allahu Akbar. Allahu Akbar. La ilaha illallah.
السلام عليكم. الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله. حي على الصلاة. حي على الصلاة. حي على الفلاح. الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله وصل وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد وعلى آل محمد الطاهرين.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. وسبحان الله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين، نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونستجيره ونستنصره، فإنه حق من هدى الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك على الحبيب المصطفى النبي الأمين المرسل رحمة للعالمين، خاتم الأنبياء والرسل أجمعين، وعلى آله الأطهار الميامين، وعلى صحبه المختارين، وعلى من اتبعه بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم يا رب العالمين، تبرأت إليك من حولي وقوتي وعلمي ومعرفتي، ولجأت إلى حولك وقوتك وعلمك وتوفيقك، فإنك تعلم ولا أعلم يا الله، وتقدر ولا أقدر، وأنت علام الغيوب. اللهم افتح لنا من أبواب فضلك، وانشر علينا خزائن علمك، وبرحمتك ارحمنا يا أرحم الراحمين يا رب العالمين. Ramadan is at our doorsteps. I think Ramadan, inshallah, will begin on Monday. And there is no way that we can receive this Ramadan without the deep sadness that is now rooted in our very hearts as we all witness the ongoing genocide in Gaza. And as we continue with the realization that from children who are dying of malnutrition to adults that are starving to death, dying of starvation is one of the cruelest ways to die. It's extremely, agonizingly painful. When we are already seeing pictures of severely emaciated children, pictures of flesh on bare bones on children in Gaza, very much reminiscent of the pictures of the Holocaust. And although it is a safe estimate that hundreds of children die every day in Gaza from starvation. The Western world, the world that controls this globe, continues to be oblivious. And even more than oblivious, directly complicit. I'm going to talk about a number of programs, media outlets that speak the truth about Gaza. But first, I'm reminded of Allah's revelation. When Allah tells us, فَمَنْ زُيِّنَ لَهُ سُوءُ عَمَلِهِ فَرَآهُ حَسَنًا. Allah speaks about those who have lost sight of the difference between what is moral and immoral, what is ethical and unethical. Those who indeed do evil and imagine this evil to be good. The ayah goes on to console the Prophet ﷺ by telling him, فَلَا تَذْهَبَ نَفْسُكَ عَلَيْهِمْ حَسَرَاتٍ إِنَّ اللَّهَ عَلِيمٌ بِمَا يَصْنَعُونَ. So don't let sorrow overtake you. Often when we respond to tragedy, if we are not conscientious in reflecting upon tragedy, we might be infected by truly a pernicious moral disease. And that is the conviction or the persuasion that perhaps the world is so messed up that it doesn't make a difference whether we recognize what is good and differentiate what is good from what is not good, what is moral from what is immoral, from what is ethical from what is unethical. The nature of falsehood is anchored on self-deception. And when we see the world that since World War II has claimed to anchor its culture and its civilization on principles of human rights, the very world that claimed to anchor its civilization on the idea that there are preemptory norms in human order, there are preemptory prohibitions that are so impermissible and so unacceptable that no one in our world order may tolerate such practices. These preemptory norms or grand norms, or what is referred to in international law as jus cogens, include the rules of jus in bello, or the way that you conduct wars according to the Geneva Conventions. Since World War II, the Western civilization has repeatedly claimed that the rules enshrined in the Geneva Conventions are inviolable, near sacred principles, preemptory norms, jus cogens, many words that simply say that violating such rules renders a person a war criminal, or renders such person a criminal against humanity. Among those prohibitions are not just the practices and the rules and the standards enshrined in the Geneva Conventions, but also the Genocide Convention, that the commission of a genocide is against humanity, that anyone supporting, participating, or in any way aiding a genocide is also a criminal against humanity. Another prohibition that falls in the same status is the prohibition against slavery, is the oppression of people and denying such people all rights to self-determination. All of these are lofty principles that have a long intellectual and philosophical history. But there is no way around the fact that the factory, the main place for the birth of these ideas in our modern world, although these ideas pre-existed the modern world, you can find vestiges and roots for these ideas in many cultures, in many normative systems, in history. But turning such ideas into a philosophy and a system and a civilization took place post-World War II, with the dawn of a new age that claimed the end of colonialism and that claimed the end of imperialism and that claimed that this is a new age of self-determination and basic, fundamental human rights that are guaranteed to all. What makes Gaza very special and very particular is that the United States, one of the main countries, if not the main country that spearheaded these ideas, is fully complicit in the genocide that is taking place. What makes Gaza very special is that all the Western powers, the very countries like Britain, that are the birthplace of the ideas of jus cogens and the philosophy of jus cogens and the philosophy of preemptory norms and the birthplace for what everyone thought are going to be deeply influential treaties and conventions like the Genocide Convention or like the Convention prohibiting slavery. Countries like Britain is fully complicit in the genocide that is taking place. Since October 7th, and the evidence is overwhelming and bewildering. It hasn't been this long since Israel committed what is known as the Flower Massacre. Israeli soldiers shot and killed and trampled over, and tanks drove over the bodies of hungry Palestinians trying to get to aid work. I ask, if you haven't done it already, I ask everyone to look up the program of Abby Martin, a program called the Empire Files. Abby Martin interviews an American Palestinian doctor who worked in the hospital called Al-Nasser. Al-Nasser Hospital was the second largest hospital in Gaza. This doctor explains in detail how they operated on patients without painkillers on the floor, how they were unable to help Palestinians with chronic conditions, which led to the death of these Palestinians. The doctor testifies in detail to Abby Martin about how newborns that needed medical help died as Palestinian doctors were entirely helpless. But he doesn't just testify as to patients that came with gross burns that the doctors were unable to do anything about. He describes how Palestinians came to the hospitals, their bodies covered in shrapnel, and then again they were unable to help them, and these Palestinians died in great agony and great pain. He describes how children were emaciated and how the doctors helping the patients themselves were hungry every day. That the doctors themselves were worried about their family members and their children chasing after convoys whenever there would be a rumor that a convoy got through. The doctor also testifies, because he's an American citizen, he was able to cross through Rafah to the Egyptian side, and how he saw lines of aid. Everything the Palestinians needed to survive was on the trucks stuck at the Egyptian side of the border. And he testifies how both the Egyptians and Israelis are preventing the aid from going across into Gaza. And how, because of Israel targeting aid convoys, how Palestinians are forced to unload the aid for the trucks that do go through and carry the aid on things like donkeys, or even just without a beast to exploit. The testimony is frightening and compelling, because he also testifies how Israeli tanks surrounded Al-Nasser hospital and how he was one of the few doctors that actually made an escape from the hospital, and how Israeli forces abducted 70 Palestinian medical personnel and led them somewhere unknown. He also talks about how a Palestinian doctor who was abducted from a Shifa hospital and then later released showed up with severe signs of torture and both arms broken. Eventually, Israel bombs Al-Nasser hospital. And eventually a massacre is committed in Al-Nasser hospital. And the US and Britain are fully complicit. Forget about grand norms. Forget about pre-emptory norms. Forget about jus cogens. Forget about international treaties and instruments. The US and Western powers, the birthplace of these intellectual ideas, are fully complicit. Because criminal complicity occurs when you have direct knowledge of the criminal act and you continue to aid the act despite your knowledge. That's criminal law 101. Everyone knows that this is criminal law 101. If you know that a crime is occurring and you aid in the commission of that crime, you are complicit. It becomes a criminal conspiracy. Abby Martin and her program, The Empire Files. There is so much there that I cannot possibly cover it or give it justice in a khutbah. In another program, this one, Richard Medhurst, Medhurst, does a report showing numerous Israeli soldiers entering Palestinian homes, joking and laughing as they show Palestinian toys. There's even a picture of an Israeli soldier sleeping in a crib in a Palestinian home, mocking the lives of Palestinian children, mocking the idea that Palestinian children have toys and are entitled to be children. But a bizarre fascination, and I encourage you to look at this Richard Medhurst program, a bizarre fascination that Israeli soldiers have with the undergarments and underwear of Palestinian women, including lingerie. They dig up lingerie and other undergarments and are fond of taking pictures showing off the lingerie of Palestinian women. A deeply sexist act. You and I know that if you are making fun of Palestinian women and their lingerie and their other underwear, panties and bras, even Israeli soldiers wearing the bras in a mocking gesture. You know how these Israeli soldiers are going to treat Palestinian women when they in fact meet them, as they imagine that these are the women that wear the lingerie that we were filmed showing. You know the hidden subtext. You know the war crimes that would be committed. You know the sexual violations that are being justified and accepted in a genocidal culture. And yet, the West is complicit. No women's rights organizations spoke up and said, "How dare you?" No one reminded these soldiers of what the Geneva Conventions say about looting. No one reminded these soldiers what the Women's Convention says about degrading mindsets that demean and devalue women. The very forces in our world that spearheaded the idea of rights to sexuality and rights to sexual choice are criminally silent as Israeli soldiers flaunt the extent to which they put no value on the rights of Palestinian women to their bodies and their privacy, leave alone their self-determination. A CNN report manages to get by about starvation in Gaza. If you haven't seen the report and seen the pictures of emaciated Palestinian children, and yet at the same time that all of this is happening, not just do Israeli soldiers flout their complete lack of regard for Palestinian lives by looting the underwear of women and looting children toys and mocking the idea that Palestinian children can play as children. If you watch one of the best journalists around, C.J. Werleman, C.J. Werleman covers for us how Netanyahu, in the midst of this genocide, invents an entirely fabricated story that has no basis, no roots, that blames Palestinians for the Holocaust. According to Netanyahu, Hitler didn't want to exterminate Palestinians, although he said it in Mein Kampf, but it doesn't matter. According to Netanyahu, Hitler was just thinking of expelling Jews. And it was the Palestinian Haj Husseini who told Hitler, if you expel the Jews, there's just going to be trouble for you down the line. And it was Haj Husseini who convinced Hitler to exterminate Jews and to create the Holocaust. Netanyahu can say an entirely fabricated, without basis, narrative like this, with no response no reaction, even among the most distinguished historians of the Holocaust. The academia is silent. Human rights organizations in Europe and the US is largely silent. And of course, the American government and British government and other Western governments, although they fully know that this discourse is being used to justify a genocide. In the midst of all of this, C.J. Werleman talks about an Israeli song that is being taught to Israeli children. This Israeli song openly calls for the extermination of the Palestinian people. The lyrics of the song being taught to Israeli children in schools openly calls for the extermination of Palestinian people. And C.G. Werleman is prohibited by YouTube from playing the song. That's the extent. It's not, the problem is not that the Israelis are teaching their children a genocidal song. The problem is if we play the song to expose the Israeli mindset to the world. Starvation, genocide, complicity of Western powers, the betrayal of the ideals of human rights, the betrayal of the ideas of humanitarian law, the betrayal of all basic and fundamental ethics. And I come back to the most painful reality of all. As we get ready to meet this Ramadan and to figure out our relationship to Allah in this Ramadan, and to figure out what we want to tell Allah in this Ramadan, how we want to pray, how we want to worship, the most painful reality of all. Muslims are a quarter of the world's population. There are 2 billion Muslims in this world. The genocide unfolds, but the reality is that Turkey and the United Arab Emirates are 2 of the largest trade partners to Israel. Why hasn't Turkey cut relations with Israel? Why hasn't the United Arab Emirates cut relations with Israel? Why hasn't Egypt cut relations with Israel? Why does Saudi Arabia allow its territory to be used to get supplies and merchandise through to Israel? Why does Jordan allow it? The truth is that 2 billion Muslims that thoroughly and completely lack a single word. The word is izzah. Izzah. Did Islam give its adherents? What was the fire of Islam to humanity? The fire of Islam to humanity was the single word, izzah. Dignity, honor, a sense of self-worth. in the same surah, Surah Fatir, after Allah warns us about those زُيِّنَ لَهُ سُوءُ عَمَلِهِ, those who do bad are part of the evil enterprise and no longer can see that what they do is evil. Everyone that continues to see a no problem with the Emirati government and its role in the genocide, because if you continue supplying a genocidal force with resources, you are part of the genocide. The whole idea of Jus Cogens is that whoever commits these crimes becomes an enemy of humankind, and that an enemy of humankind becomes a pariah. You don't deal with them, you don't talk with them, you don't visit them, you don't give them comfort, you don't give them quarter. But Israel is committing a genocide. And the West is complicit in this genocide, including, or primarily, the US. And the Emirat gives quarter to the Israelis despite the genocide. And Saudi Arabia gives quarter to the Israelis despite the genocide. And Egypt gives quarter to the Israelis despite the genocide. And Turkey gives quarter to the Israelis despite the genocide. And any Muslim who doesn't see a problem with other Muslims giving quarter to the Israelis despite the genocide is exactly what Surah Fatir is talking about. Those whose deeds are deeds of su', of evil, and yet somehow they become oblivious to this evil. But in the same surah, Allah tells us the heart of the problem. The heart of the problem is, where do you find your izzah? What is the source of your honor and dignity? And Allah tells us, من كان يريد العزة فلله العزة جميعا. If you want izzah, if you want your dignity and your honor, then find it with Allah and no other than Allah. Doesn't Allah in Surah An-Nisa reminds us, الذين يتخذون الكافرين أولياء من دون المؤمنين أيبتغون عندهم العزة فإن العزة لله جميعا. How about those who find their honor and their dignity, their sense of worth, in allying themselves with disbelievers against their fellow Muslims? And Allah asks these people rhetorically, do you think this is where your izzah is? Because if that's what you think, if you think that your well-being, your sense of dignity, your sense of honor, your sense of well-being, your sense of goodness, your sense of morality, your sense of ethics is by aligning themselves to the Israelis as they commit a genocide against their fellow Muslims, by allowing their lands and airspace to be used to make sure that Israel does not suffer in this genocide, as the Saudis have done, and the Emiratis have done, and the Jordanians have done, and the Egyptians have done, and the Turks have done. Then there is a fundamental and basic problem. Your sense of izzah is so flawed that you fall in the category worse than kufr, the category of nifaq, those who are truly hypocrites. And Allah does not aid or support either the hypocrites or those who aid and support the hypocrites. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم أسأل الله يستجب لكم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وسبحان الله العلي العظيم والحمد لله رب العالمين. As Israel continued to bomb Palestinian hospitals, to abduct Palestinian doctors and nurses, to make them disappear, to torture them, and sometimes to even execute them, I saw a video, and you can watch this if you want. On Richard Medhurst's program. Richard Medhurst talks about a British fellow who volunteered in the Israeli army and filmed himself showing off Palestinian toys and showing off Palestinian undergarments, women's undergarments, mocking these Palestinian women and mocking Palestinian children. And then this fellow returned to Britain after having served his round in the genocide. And he is received in Britain as a hero. In fact, there was a fundraiser held that he was the keynote in. Again, you can watch this on Richard Medhurst if you want. And I pause and think, taking part in a genocide is not a bit less than being a terrorist or taking part in a terrorist act. How in God's name, if this person would have gone to the Middle East and joined a terrorist group, he would come back to Britain to confront a whole set of charges. But this fellow goes to the Middle East, takes part in a genocide, and returns to his life in Britain as a hero. Now, it just so happened that Richard Medhurst talked about one example. But how many Americans, how many British, how many Indians? I got into a great deal of trouble because I spoke the truth about Indians joining the Israeli army for the pleasure of killing Muslims. But it's happening, and there is no way for anyone to have any type of accountability over the Israeli army in terms of who they permit to join their forces or not join their forces. We had that type of oversight over the Iraqis, over the Syrians, over all and every Muslim force. But the Israelis get a carte blanche. Another thing, after the Israelis committed a massacre in a Nasser hospital, and now every main or minor hospital in Gaza has been targeted. Massacres against hospitals have become so commonplace that Western powers don't bother protesting anymore. I saw the most disgusting and repulsive letter signed by Israeli doctors. The Israeli doctors defend the targeting of Palestinian hospitals and say it is not Israel's fault. It is the fault of Arabs, and they use Arabs, who have used hospitals as bastions for terrorist cells, as cover for terrorism. In the letter, these doctors say that Israel and the Israeli army should not allow those Arabs to exploit Western morality in order to protect their terrorist elements by placing them in hospitals. This letter exemplifies the entire logic of the racist genocide that is taking place. Muslims are not entitled to the protections of Jewish slogans or preemptory norms or human rights, because these are really Western concepts for civilized people who understand what these moral concepts mean. They don't apply to Arabs, and they don't apply to Palestinians, and they don't apply to Muslims. Because Muslims and Arabs and Palestinians don't understand these lofty Western standards. It is exactly the logic, the very ideology that colonialism adopted as it destroyed indigenous culture after indigenous culture. An Israeli advisor to Netanyahu came on American TV and said, by the standards of Western wars, Israel is acting morally. And I paused and thought of what Western wars is he talking about? His point is that if you compare Israel, if you hold Israel to the standards of wars launched by the West, then you will come to the conclusion that Israel is acting morally. Is he talking about the siege of Warsaw? Is he talking about the siege of Berlin? Is he talking about what the United States did in Vietnam? Is he talking about our impunity over Iraq and over Afghanistan? The very logic that Israel constantly relies on is that, look, what we are doing to the indigenous Palestinian people is not that bad if you compare it to what the Dutch did in South Africa, what the Australians did in Australia, what the Spaniards did in South America. They are actually referring to the wars of the 17th century and the erasure of indigenous cultures, and saying, if you compare us to this morality, then what we are doing in Gaza is not that bad. And as I allow myself to be shocked, very quickly I am reminded that what is even more shocking is the behavior of Muslims towards fellow Muslims. Then, as if a sign from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I got the urge to check out C.G. Whirlman again. And I found a most curious video by this non-Muslim journalist. This non-Muslim journalist says in his video, the genocide is a living evidence of the utter disempowerment of Muslims all around the world. And that Muslims are a failed project after Sykes-Picot, the French-British agreement that divided up the Middle East and that ultimately decided that there will be a Saudi Arabia, there will be borders between Egypt and Sudan, Egypt and Libya, and so on and so forth. And C.G. Whirlman says, isn't it time for Muslims to realize that they need an entire paradigm shift? And this non-Muslim fellow says, can you imagine if all Muslims united under a single banner? If all Muslims became a single power? Can you imagine what Muslim presence in our world would mean? I agree with C.G. Whirlman. We need an entire paradigm shift. The present nation-state order for Muslims is not working. We need to reimagine the Muslim Khilafah. Our record since the abolition of the Khilafah has been nothing but horrendous. We need to reimagine bringing back that symbol of Muslim unity and demanding that the world order accommodate that symbol of Muslim unity. We need to reimagine our sovereignty over the holy sites. We need to reimagine our demands over Al-Aqsa Mosque. We cannot continue in our present state, which utterly lacks any izzah. There is not the woof of izzah in our present state. The leaders of Muslim nations have forgotten utterly what al-izzah billah means. And all their izzah is directed towards the same West that is complicit in the genocide. we need to bring back to our souls, to our hearts, to our spirits, what al-Izzah billah means in our current world order. Not in the insanity and barbarity and cruelty of a movement like ISIS, which did nothing to bring Izzah to Muslims. It only victimized and murdered and tortured Muslims. But as a rethinking of the world order that we are an integral part of, as quarter of the world population. Allahumma afu anna, Allahumma aghfir lana, Allahumma arhamna ya Rahman ya Rahim, Allahumma hdina li aqraba min hadha rashada, Allahumma ansur ahli Gaza, Allahumma kun fi awnihim ya Rabb al-alamin, Allahumma sabbirhum wa ayyidhum wa azirhum ya Allah ya Kareem. أنت القادر ولا يقدر عليك أحد. Allah forgive our sins. Allah guide us to a better faith and a better path and a better way. Allah remind us of what Izzah means and what Izzah in you means. Allah aid the people of Gaza and give them perseverance and help them through their suffering. Ya Allah, Ya Ali, Ya Azim, wa aqim as-salah.